Season 2 of Written in Stone is generously supported by RAB. Founded in 1981 by climbers, for climbers, RAB are on a journey to reduce the impact of their business, expand access to the outdoors, and preserve our mountain playgrounds for future generations. RAB, the mountains are our meeting place. And this episode is brought to you by Tension Climbing, training and performance equipment built with improvement in mind. Use code WRITTEN15 for 15% off of select items. Just off Broom Grove Road on the campus of Sheffield Hallam University is a historic gritstone wall. It was discovered in the late 70s by a climber named Pete O'Donovan, nicknamed Pod, so it came to be known as Pod's Wall. Back then, it wasn't Sheffield Hallam, but Sheffield Polytechnic, and its wall became a popular bouldering and training spot for area climbers. Surely every Sheffield legend you can name could be found there at some point or another, and Sheffield is well known for its climbing legends. But Sheffield is also known for its rain, and this wall on Broom Grove Road stayed dry, so it quickly became the spot. Now, you might be imagining some overhanging roadside boulder capped with a little roof shielding it from a downpour, and I wouldn't blame you for your optimism. But in this case, it was a balcony that kept the wall dry, and the wall was on the side of a building. Local gritstone had been cut into irregular blocks, creating a series of edges, some flat, some sloping, some side pulls, and some down pulls that could be used for both short up problems or a long, hard traverse. On this day in 1982, a young man is traversing the wall by himself. Dark hair and brows with an intensely focused gaze, he's absorbed in the moment, but simultaneously somewhere else. Approximately 4,561 miles away, actually. The fact that he was zeroed in on the small, sloping edges and tiny footholds with the precision that he was, had everything to do with the fact that he was entirely enveloped in a much bigger goal. He wanted to be the best. When he finished traversing, he went inside to do pull-ups. Pete O'Donovan had suggested that it might help his climbing, and he was willing to try anything that might help. Attached to a beam by climbers were a series of wooden blocks, some just big enough for a single pad of the fingertips, some smaller. He grabbed them and pulled up. At the top, he locked off, staring at the words written in felt-tip pen, "Jim Collins was here." Another rep, "Jim Collins was here." And another, "Jim Collins was here." Jim Collins was one of the best, a climber in America who'd done some of the hardest routes around, and this young climber, Jerry Moffatt, had read these words thousands upon thousands of times. Jim Collins was here. He had to test himself on Collins' roots. He had to go to America. He had to be the best. I'm Chris Hampton. You're listening to Written in Stone, climbing's most important ascents. This is Season 2, the 1980s.
1, 2.
Born in 1963 in Leicestershire, England, a few hours north of London, he didn't always have that same hope of becoming the best. A school progress report from 1971, when he had just turned 8 years old, read,
"With all the efforts that have been made to help, it is disappointing that he has not achieved a higher standard. We wish him well and hope that a complete change will have the desired effect."
There would indeed be a complete change, one they couldn't have possibly imagined. Jeremy, as he was still known, was popular and funny. He liked art class because it made sense. The other classes, words and numbers, not so much. No matter how hard he tried, he just couldn't improve. But out on the track or the pitch, it was different. There, he saw that his hard work could pay off. When he worked hard, he got better. When he tried hard, he won. And he tried harder than everyone. Eventually, he'd be diagnosed with dyslexia, explaining the issues he'd had in school, but not doing much to repair the self-confidence that had been shattered by the teachers who just assumed he wasn't smart or didn't try. His parents knew that with the right help, he could succeed, and they had the means, so Jeremy was enrolled in schools with new programs specifically for dyslexic children. Ultimately, he ended up in North Wales at a school called St. David's, where he'd get so busy with other sports that he nearly missed an invitation to join the climbing club on an outing. But he saw the excitement it filled his friends with, so lucky for us, he chose to make it to that outing. And that's all it took. Same as you and I, many years later, young Jerry Moffatt was hooked. He devoured the magazines, imitated the rock stars, and climbed obsessively. He got better and better. Over summer break from school, he trained on the back wall in his garden, realizing that the dyslexia didn't at all stop him from remembering complex, intricate sequences. When back from break, he was climbing better than the instructor. He was climbing better than nearly everyone at the crags. There was just one thing left. He wanted to do a first ascent. He wanted to see his name in the magazines. See, back then, climbing was small enough that the magazines reported on new routes at pretty much any grade. So after doing what he assumed was likely a first ascent, a route up maybe the worst rock in a nearby quarry, he wrote up the details to send to Jeff Birtles at Crags Magazine, but hesitated upon signing his name. Jerry Moffatt didn't sound that cool to him. It's what his parents and teachers called him. Friends called him Jez, but that didn't really do it either. When the next issue of Crag arrived, he tore it open to find the details about the route had indeed made it into the magazine, including the name he had signed, Jerry Moffatt. And that confidence boost was all he needed. In 1980, Jerry Moffatt was 17 years old and completely committed to climbing. He'd just finished school with better than expected grades, but still not quite good enough to get him into the college program he'd hoped for. Not that he was hoping very hard. Since climbing had taken hold of his life, he was sure that climbing was all he really wanted to do. At the time, the British economy wasn't doing very well. Under Margaret Thatcher, unemployment had nearly doubled to 2 million people. Jobs were hard to come by, and while the average British citizen hoped to not need to go on the dole, the British government's version of unemployment payments, going on the dole seemed, at the time, the best possible scenario for a young man whose dream was to be a full-time dirtbag climber. So every couple of weeks, Jerry signed his name and got a check from the government. 15 pounds, just enough to survive if he rationed it right. And that wouldn't be a problem, because the blueprint had already been sorted out. Jerry hitchhiked to the small town of Stony Middleton in the Peak District, where he was sure of a few things. Number one, climbers said you could climb there all winter and that the crag stayed partly dry. 2, there was an abandoned woodshed that many other climbers on the dole also called home. And 3, the hardest routes in the country were there, including several unclimbed projects. And so for 2 years, Jerry would make his home at Stony Middleton. Every morning, he'd make his way to the Lover's Leap Cafe. Climbers from all over would assemble here, but often it was the same names who just happened to be some of the best in the world. Tom Proctor, who'd led the charge here in the 70s, and Ron Fawcett, who'd taken up that torch. Dougie Hall, a ubiquitous British climber who was content to be the second to do things, but always got them done. Kim Kerrigan, the Australian superstar known for traveling the world and doing the hardest routes everywhere, was also often around. By the late morning, the climbers would spread out throughout the area. some repeating the new hard routes, some vying for first free ascents of old aid lines. And in the evening, they'd congregate again at the Moon Inn. It was at this pub where they'd recount their adventures of the day, no doubt exaggerating the difficulties and sandbagging the grades all at the same time. And eventually, Jerry would stumble out into the winter darkness, make his way back to the woodshed, clear out space between the wood piles for his thin sleeping bag, put on every article of clothing he owned, and fall off to sleep. And over those 2 years, Jerry had been steadily making a name for himself, ticking off top-level routes at Stony. But no route meant more than Little Plum. In 1981, in the attic of a small terraced house in Sheffield, the center of the climbing community in the UK, Rab Carrington made the first sleeping bag to bear his name. More than 40 years later, the people at Rab are still crafting rugged, high-performance clothing and equipment for the mountains, the kind of gear that becomes a staple in your kit that you'd rather repair than replace. Rab are on a journey to reduce the impact of their business and expand access to the outdoors. They're committed to preserving our mountain playgrounds for future generations because they know that the mountains are our meeting place. An old two-pitch aid route from the 60s, originally done by a teenage Jeff Birtles, Little Plum had become a sought-after first free ascent. Tom Proctor had put considerable time into freeing the first pitch, as had Dougie Hall and Kim Kerrigan. Even the climber at the top of the British ranks at the time, Ron Fawcett, had made attempts. The legend of Little Plum just grew bigger and bigger. Success on the route was going to revolve around one move, a huge lunge to a tiny edge. Make it through that move, and you'd make history. Jerry Moffatt wanted to make history. So in typical fashion, he put his head down and he got to work. He'd been trying the move for a few days, but to no avail. This time, when he lowered down to the belay, he noticed that 2 figures had come out of the cafe down below and had stopped to watch the show on Little Plum. It was Kim Kerrigan and Dougie Hall. Jerry thought back to his first encounter with Dougie Hall while trying a route called Void at Traumatic. At the time, blissfully unaware of the ethical rules of the game, Jerry had rested on the rope before continuing the climb. "Useless doggers," Dougie muttered, shaking his head at the transgressions. But see, when the greatest athletes are offered a challenge, particularly in the form of someone doubting them, they step up in a big way. And Jerry Moffatt was on his way to being a great athlete. This was his moment, the biggest stage with 2 of the biggest stars watching him, on a route they had failed to do. And not only had they failed to do the route, but Kim and Dougie had recently been to America, and they thought that Little Plum was probably harder than Psycho, the world-famous blank roof in El Dorado Canyon, Colorado, first climbed by Jim Collins, that name over the fingerboard down at the Polytechnic, and still awaiting the coveted second ascent. Little Plum could be harder. So Jerry started up the faint groove that starts the route. From his book, Revelations, co-written with Niall Grimes, Jerry writes, "I moved up to the crux, squeezed a pathetic undercling with my left hand, got a vicious little pinch hold with my right, ran my feet up the wall below, then launched my body at full stretch for the matchbox edge above. My fingers touched it. As the upward momentum of my body came to a stop, I fastened the tips of my fingers around it. When my body then sagged down again, all my weight came onto this tiny hold. I started squeezing on the hold. Somehow, I managed to hold it. I got my falling body under control, sorted myself out, and quickly finished the pitch." Kim and Dougie called up their congratulations. He'd done it, but he wasn't done. Not by a long shot. There was a second pitch to do, one that nobody had seriously attempted because its 6-foot roof just looked impossible. But Jerry couldn't get it out of his mind. It still seemed unfinished. So on a rest day, with all of the questions about that supposedly unfree climbable stretch of rock swirling in his head, he decided to go have a look. Hidden holds in the back of the high roof allowed Jerry to reach way out to the lip. But from that extended position, he just couldn't hold the swing and went spinning into space every attempt. Steadying himself for another try, he looked down to the road below and took a breath. To his surprise, somebody was watching. This time, it was Jeff Bertels, the first ascensionist and now editor of Craig's magazine. Again, he was in the arena, eager to show the crowd what he could do. This was his moment. Cue the lights, cue the music, and then Jeff called up, "Get on with it. Stop messing about." That was all he needed. Again, he made the big reach to the lip, but this time, as his feet cut, his will held on. Instinctively, he threw his feet toward the lip, catching a toe hook and matching hands on the jug. In seconds, he was on top. Jeff was smiling. He knew what he'd just witnessed. But Jerry was already somewhere else. Jerry was on his way to America. Having done the hardest route at Stony, probably the hardest in the country, Jerry moved on. He'd planned a trip to the U.S. with his mate Chris Gore, but he'd also been planning his own hit list that would take him from one hard route to another, coast to coast. Pod, the namesake of the famous Broom Grove Road traverse wall, had done Supercrack in New York's Gunks. At 12 plus, it was one of the hardest and most famous in the country. And Pod was sure Jerry could flash it. And so he gave him all the details that he could, the ring locks, the jug rest in the middle, all of it. At a climbers' meet organized by the British Mountaineering Council, Jerry had run into a California climber named Randy Vogel, who wrote the guides to Joshua Tree, and grilled him about a desperate thin crack put up by Tony Yaniro of Grand Illusion fame called Equinox. That left the middle of America, where Jerry had special plans. He was going to go to Colorado and repeat the two unrepeated, feared, and revered Jim Collins routes, Psycho and Genesis. With a few months before departure, Jerry set to work. He'd go to the Peak District and seek out every finger-sized crack he could find, doing laps of various eliminates using ring locks and fingertip jams instead of the laybacks and face holds that made the routes easier. All the while with the specter of unmatched difficulty on Supercrack and Equinox fueling his obsession. For the impossible blank roof of Psycho, he set up shop under Tom's roof at Stony Middleton, creating harder and harder variations, climbing out the roof, reversing the route, climbing another harder variation, reversing again, and so on. Partnerless and in the rain, he'd find caves where he could traverse ad nauseum, building up the fitness to hang on to anything forever. To prepare for the tiny holds on Genesis, he came up with every possible eliminate and variation on the -10 wall at Stony, a polished, vertical limestone panel covered in tiny, slippery holds. He was obsessed. And of course, Pod's wall, back and forth on the gritstone block edges, then inside for more pull-ups and more pull-ups. Jim Collins was here. Another rep. Jim Collins was here. This time, he locked off and stared at it for minutes. Jim Collins was here. Soon, Jerry Moffatt would be there too. In September of 1982, Jerry and Chris landed in New York and quickly made their way to the small town of New Paltz, where they would spend their first 2 weeks in the U.S. It was soon evident that the rock and style in the Gunks wasn't what they were used to. The first week and a half were spent doing classics and getting stopped cold on relatively easy grades. Doubts started to creep in, but when Jerry walked out to take a look at Supercrack, all of the motivation returned in an instant. It looked fantastic. He could hardly wait. And with only 2 days left in New York, he would hardly have to. The next morning, too excited to take his planned rest day, Jerry, Chris, and an American they'd been climbing with, Skip Guerin, made the 90-minute walk out to Skytop. Jerry tied in, sat down, and tried to calm his nerves. He'd spent so much time preparing. He'd imagined this moment. Now, he was here. But this grade had never been flashed before. No matter, he thought. I'm Jerry Moffatt. I'm the best climber in the world. He pulled on in a fight from the start, just how he liked it. Climbing quickly, but getting pumped just as fast, he soon came to the half-height roof, above which he knew was a flat jug he could recover on. Giving it everything he had, he just made it to the jug and settled in to get it all back. With enough recovered, he got himself stood up on the jug and realized that what he had left was draining quickly. With feet scraping and slipping off of the wall, Jerry was right where he wanted to be, right in the midst of what he was best at, fighting for it with everything he could muster. In his element, Jerry finished the pitch, no falls, becoming the first to flash the grade. 1 down, 3 to go. The next day, they were off to Colorado. Skip lived in Boulder and offered not only to give them a ride, but to let them stay at his house, just a short drive from El Dorado Canyon. But once in Boulder, Jerry decided that now that he was the best, he needed to look the part. In Revelations, Jerry remembers. The Colorado look, pioneered by Collins and friends, was where it was at, and we wanted to get with it. The tube socks, long sports socks parallel-sided without any knitted heel, had to come halfway up the calf. The ultimate was to try to get the tube sock tan line, a deep bronze that went from the crotch area where the tiny sports shorts finished. We wanted to look cool like Americans. As I walked out of the shop that morning into the Colorado sunshine with my new socks and shorts, I felt like $1 million. Still with the momentum of Supercrack pulling him along, Jerry and his tube socks made their way to Psycho. He'd seen the photos of Jim Collins, and there were only a couple of holds for the entirety of the 10-foot roof, so he knew what he had to do. But it felt way harder than he expected. Were Kim and Dougie wrong? Was this actually harder than Little Plum? Jerry began to wonder if he was actually as good as he'd started to believe.
With all the efforts that have been made to help, it is disappointing that he has not achieved a higher standard. We wish him well and hope that a complete change will have the desired effect.
Look, I make my living as a climbing coach, but I'll be the first to tell you that ever since climbers first decided they wanted to get better, there's been one best way to improve: climb intentionally. So if you can do your climbing on terrain that was built specifically for that, it's a cheat code. And when it comes to this, there's one training board out there that stands above the rest: the Tension Board 2. Here's why. It was designed by people who actually train on boards. With mastery in mind, every decision made with purpose, and over 15,000 climbs in the database and growing, it's not even a question. On all levels, the TB2 is the final boss of training boards. The mix of wood and plastic allows for skin-friendly tiny grips as well as bigger, slopier, open-handed compression climbing. And there are 4 different board sizes to choose from, so whether you run a gym or built yourself a training shed, they've got one for you. And they also make, right here in the USA, a whole suite of premium training and performance goods. And you can get many of those for 15% off if you use the code WRITTEN15. Tension Climbing. Mastery over success. Sure, the difficulty of Psycho had caught him off guard. But Jerry wasn't so easily turned away. On day 2, on his first try of the day, something clicked. He'd encountered this before, on one of his variations to Tom's roof at Stony. On that one, he'd matched the hold in the roof and reached with the other hand. That might work here as well. And so he reached out to the edge, matched it, and in disbelief, began casually reaching to the lip. He was still on. And then it was done. The second ascent of Psycho. 2 down, 2 to go. Jerry Moffatt was here. Excited beyond belief, Jerry went straight away to Genesis and got worked. A different style altogether, slightly overhanging with tiny polished holds. It felt impossible. One huge move in the middle, in particular, didn't even make sense, and Jerry never even got close. It had taken Jim Collins over 100 tries, so maybe it was just playing too hard. That night, talking with Skip's roommate, Bob Horan, Jerry mentioned the move. Bob had been trying the route and gave Jerry the beta he'd figured out, using a big hold as a Gaston instead of the obvious way that Jerry had been trying. The next day, Jerry went out to try the new method and fired the route straight away. No problems. Shortly after, he repeated the route on top rope in his Nikes. One of the hardest, most revered routes in the country, and he'd just done it in his sneakers, in front of a crowd of climbers. Around this same time, a camera crew was in El Dorado Canyon filming for a TV program called On the Rocks. Talking to Jerry, the interviewer asks, "What is it you like about climbing?" And 19-year-old Jerry Moffatt looks directly into the camera and says, "I like to burn people off." 3 down, 1 to go. Winter was coming to Colorado, so Jerry and Chris headed for California. At Joshua Tree, they were greeted with a whole new style of climbing, friction and cracks with very few face holds. Chris took to it quickly, while Jerry floundered. But he'd been in this spot before and knew that he could eventually master this style too. So he kept at it. One day, while gearing up to try an 11D called Spiderline, a tanned, blonde climber in white karate pants came walking up. A stone master, John Backer. He looked right at Jerry. "Are you Jerry Mufflet?" "Yeah, it's Moffatt." "Sure it is. Good to see you." With that, Backer pulled onto Spiderline and disappeared over the top. Free solo, like it was nothing. Jerry scraped his way up it on lead, barely keeping it together. Over the next few weeks, he'd see Backer many times, always amazed at his mastery of the climbing here. Backer was the first to do Equinox on top rope before Yaniro led it, so Jerry mined him for details. He confided that his goal was to do it in 3 days. "No, man, you should flash that thing." Jerry knew he wasn't ready, so he dedicated himself to preparing. He devoured any training advice Backer would give, and in a few weeks' time, he was climbing as well as Backer himself, like he'd spent every winter of his life in J-Tree. John, Chris, and Jerry hiked across the desert toward the undulating golden shield of granite, split by a diagonal and curving thin crack. Equinox. 1 to go. Having already soloed a circuit of cracks to warm up, Jerry was ready. He pulled on and never second-guessed a move. Before he knew it, he was at the top. Never even got pumped. Never got tired. The second time 12C had been flashed, and he'd done both. In a foreign country, on foreign rock. Jerry Moffatt was the best climber in the world. Back home in the UK, that still meant being on the dole and sleeping in a cave so that he could climb every day. Lower Pentruan was the new place to be, so Jerry set up shop there in what became known as Paracella's Cave, along with other legends Tim Freeman, Martin Basher Atkinson, and Andy Pollitt. Eager to push the limits, Jerry had rappelled down a steep, nearly blank wall and put in a couple of bolts. After some work, he felt like he might just be able to do it, but it would certainly be one of the hardest routes around. Maybe 7C+, or 13A. And as he tied in below the route, ready to give it a go, a crowd assembled to watch. Among them was a muscular man he recognized as Germany's top climber, Wolfgang Gulich. Just as he had with Kim and Dougie and then Jeff on Little Plum, Jerry wanted to impress his peers. "Watch this," he thought. And then he shot up the route, putting on a flawless performance. Masterclass, he called it, and with its grade now accepted at 8A or 13B, it would have been the first of the grade in the country. A few days later, in the Peak District, Jerry bumped into Wolfgang again. He asked him about his home area, the Frankenjura. He'd seen Thomas Ballenberger's photos in the magazines and thought the place looked incredible. Wolfgang, known for his hospitality and generosity, said that he was heading back to Germany at the end of the day and offered Jerry a spot in his tiny, already full Volkswagen Golf. Stopping only for the ferry, the jam-packed clown car drove nearly straight through the 20 hours to Wolfgang's house. Inside, sitting around the kitchen table, were several climbers. Kim Kerrigan, who Jerry already knew, and a German mountain of a man that Jerry recognized as Kurt Albert. After the obligatory coffee and pastries, Kim announced that he was going climbing. Jerry, sleep-deprived and delirious, asked to join. Now, what happened next depends on which resource you consult, but they all have the same basic outcome. According to Jerry, when he and Kim arrived at the crag, Jerry recognized a route from the magazines. In 1981, Kurt Albert had climbed the hardest route in the country, Saltans, at 12C. He soon followed that up with Magnet, a step harder, and had only recently, and happily, relinquished the throne of best climber in Germany to his good friend Wolfgang. And Jerry had to climb it. And so he did, in his usual style, fighting for his life, on site, no falls. But if you believe Kurt Albert's account of the story, Jerry didn't make it to Saltans until a few days into his trip. He'd already been on-siting everything they showed him, and Kurt was getting sick of it. So he rappelled down and smeared some slippery goo on one of the crux holds. When Jerry arrived there, he simply screamed down, "You assholes!" and kept climbing, still finishing the on-site. I prefer Kurt's version of events, but regardless, this is how legends are made. Wolfgang, usually quiet and stoic, appreciated the wiry ball of energy, power, and endless enthusiasm that was Jerry Moffatt. That summer, they became the best friends. They saw in each other someone who understood what it was like to be at the top, someone to draft behind when you're unsure, and someone to surge in front of when you're confident. But always someone who would be right there. Someone who shared your passions, could celebrate your wins, and could also taste the same defeat. Wolfgang didn't see himself as competitive. He was happy to be in the shadow of the best in the world at the time. First Ron Fawcett and John Backer, and now Jerry. But Kim Kerrigan had told Wolfgang that he could be the best ever, and he had pushed him toward doing first ascents of his own. That summer, Jerry had done all of the hardest routes in the forest and was on the hunt for something harder. When it came to finding hard routes, the forest of the Frankenjura had a secret weapon: Flipper feats. At 5 foot 2 inches and all muscle, Flipper didn't much care for the rules of the game everyone else was playing. He was 100% interested in doing difficult moves, and it didn't matter in the slightest to him if you hung on the rope or ever sent the route, as the rules call it. Once he had done all of the hard moves, he moved on. That was enough for him, and he'd excitedly show the rope length of incredibly hard moves to the other climbers, to Kurt Albert and Wolfgang and whoever, and let them get credit for the first ascent. He just didn't understand the fuss about going from the bottom to the top with no falls. Wolfgang told Jerry about a route of Flipper's called the Face. As usual, Flipper had bolted it, worked out the moves, and left it behind for the folks who wanted to play their game of going bottom to top. Midway up the route, 2 side-by-side mono pockets made up the eyes of a smiling face, taunting whoever had the hubris to try to pass. And despite many capable, strong German climbers having tried the line, it remained unfinished. Wolfgang suggested Jerry give it a try, and as Jerry tended to do, he was immediately obsessed. It seemed to him like the hardest route he'd ever tried, definitely harder than Masterclass. 2 days in, with fingers cut by the sharp pockets, Jerry still hadn't done it. and he had only 1 day left before he needed to return home to the UK. Having no car, no partners interested in going to the area, he felt stuck, sure that the next level was right there, waiting for him, if he just had a chance. Chris Gore, who'd come over to visit, managed to borrow a car for the final few hours they had available, but they were going to have to make it quick. The pressure was on, and Jerry loved the pressure. He starts up the crack feature, climbing confidently into the big cross that begins the surprisingly difficult traverse on terrible footholds. This leads him into a powerful undercling move, and finally to a good rest, where he can stare down the face hold, a few hard moves out to his right. He reaches up to a mono, makes a hard cross to a back three pocket, and decisively stabs into the eyes of the face, one finger in each eye hole. Another big move to a sharp side pull, followed by a big dead point, and he's through the hardest climbing. All he has to do now is keep it together for the slab at the top. And he will have done the first grade 10 climb in Germany, and the first 13C in the world. And the pressure builds. There's not time for another try. His fingers are bleeding through the tape. He's tired, but he's sure. He's Jerry Moffatt, and Jerry Moffatt is the best climber in the world.
1, 2.
Written in Stone is produced by me, Chris Hampton, with help from Riley Rush for Plugtone Audio, a group of the best, most impactful podcasts in the outdoor industry. If you haven't read Jerry's book, Revelations, written with Niall Grimes, what on earth are you waiting for? Click the link in the description and do it now. And remember, this show is 100% rooted in the facts, but like Todd Skinner always said, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. And if you love what you're hearing, give us those 5 stars and a glowing review, join our Patreon, the Secret Stoners Club, and tell everyone you know, at the crag, at the gym, in that internet forum where everyone's shouting into the void, and together we can tell the stories of climbing's most important ascents, 1 decade at a time. Secret Stoners. I realize I enunciated the T in secret really aggressively. That's because I've been listening to GNX from Kendrick Lamar a lot, and he enunciates in a way I've never heard anyone enunciate. But hearing him do that, I do remember getting the advice in a studio once to enunciate really clearly the T's and the S's at the end of lines. Anyway, let me get this thing back on course. First things first, shout out to the newest rock stars, Sasha and Patrick. I appreciate you. I appreciate the support. Second, thanks to everyone who have been leaving comments on the giveaway for the 40 Years of Sport Climbing, Alan Watts poster. It's so much fun to read through those comments. It's going to be agonizing that I can't give everyone a poster because I just appreciate all of your love for history. It warms my heart to know that there's a group of people out there like you who love listening to this thing and appreciate the history the way that you do. I will be choosing those winners and sending those out soon. I posted this in that thread, but I made the error of, I thought that I had ordered 2 3-packs of mailing tubes, but I had actually ordered 2 1-packs. Why they still call it a pack when it's just one, I don't know. But I ordered 2 total. So I've reordered and I'm waiting for those to show up before I pick winners and before I ship those out. All right. This episode was shockingly difficult to write. I've read Revelations several times, and then I was also skimming through it while working on this episode. But Jerry did a lot in a really short period of time. He very quickly catapulted himself into the number one spot in the world. And I think the undisputed number one spot in the world for a few years. And then he got injured and disappeared, and then he comes back. And we'll get into all that later this season. But packing so much into this one period just for me to get to his ascent of the face, it's really difficult to do. And if you have not read Revelations by Jerry Moffatt and Niall Grimes, you should absolutely do that. A lot of people put it at the top of their list. I don't know if it's at the top of my list, but it's close. And I think actually the thing that moved it out of the top spot on my list is the same problem I had here. He packed so much into a short period of time. And then, of course, to add to that difficulty, I went to the library at Knowles to try to get some of the magazine articles Jerry had written to maybe just fill in with some context. And they were closed for the entire holidays. So there were 2 weeks there. They open back up now. When you're hearing this episode, they are opened back up. So I wasn't able to spend much time in there looking for context clues and for Jerry's feelings at the time instead of relying on his memories during the book. So if I do find anything really interesting as I go back into there, because like I said, there's more Jerry Moffatt to come, I will be doing some bonus episodes on those things that I find. I read multiple places that he was prolific at writing articles at the time, so I'm interested to go and find those. Now, I did post in the Patreon today. It's scheduled to be on there right now when you're hearing this, a PDF that I pulled out of a book called The Power of Climbing that is profiles of British climbers. It's a really interesting read, and I learned a lot about people that I didn't know anything about, and also some bits and pieces about climbers I did know about. But in the back of the book, there's an interesting table that is all of the strongest British climbers and all of the hardest routes in the world as of, I'm going off memory here, it was either 1990 or 1991. So, and who had climbed what. It's a really neat table to look at. Of course, there's Johnny Dawes, Shawn Miles, Andy Pollitt, Jerry Moffatt, Ben Moon. They're all in there. And it's just really pretty fun to look at who had done what at that time. And I believe it was just pretty immediately after Hubble. So go check that out. There's also a similar table in the back of the 8th grade, the French book that we're almost finished translating and putting into a PDF. It should be up for you all within the next week or so. I think it would be incredibly difficult, especially in the US, to make a chart like that today, but I do think it's a really interesting thing to look back at. All right. Next week, we have an interview. I don't think I've laughed as much ever at a single question, at a single answer to a question as I did in this interview. And it was with a person who, the very first time they met Jerry Moffatt, it ended up with Jerry naked and tied to a pipe in an abandoned building. I'll see you next week.